Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the same Texas Politics Project. Happy spring post-tax day morning to you.
Yeah, that's all right.
It's mostly over.
Yeah, exactly. I was waiting a couple things here and there, but, it's all right.
So, today we want to talk a little bit about some internal, something at the intersection of campaign politics and internal politics in the Texas legislature. But, on brand a little bit, I thought we'd start with some news from the world of Texas polling. Mm-hmm. Woke up this morning, heard on our local NPR station reporting that the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation released a poll this morning that, among other things, provides a new snapshot of some of these big top-of-the-ballot races that we've been following in Texas. The poll conducted what they called per their executive summary, a representative survey of 1,600 likely voters between April 5th and 10th of this year. So the poll has margin of error plus or minus 2.45%. No big surprises to me here. I mean, most of these seemed on track with what we've been seeing, right? I mean, we had the presidential race. It was interesting that not unlike what we got, I guess. Donald Trump led Biden by 12 percentage points, 46 to 34 in the 5-candidate matchup.
Right.
And then same margin, slightly different percentages, not surprised, as you would expect. A 12% lead where Trump's share goes up to 48, Biden's to 36 in Texas if you just do a head-to-head.
Right. I mean, interestingly, I think in that is in the Senate race, Cruz only held a 5-point advantage over Colin Allred in the same polling, which is also kind of just interesting in and of itself, right?
Yes. There are a lot of interesting things going on, and again, they're facing some of the same things we do. Like, I wonder, we'll have to look, and I don't think they included a top-line document, or at least I haven't seen one so far.
I didn't see one in the main report.
I haven't dug through every bit of documentation on this because it came out this morning. And
they tend to break their stuff up a little bit and sort of, I think, do
Right.
these kind of individual reports as opposed to releasing the whole top-line document. I mean,
Right.
I think for anyone looking at this and I mean, I like the work they're doing, and I'm happy that they're oversampling Hispanics as much as they are and focusing on that. At the same time, one thing about this poll that kind of comes up a lot, at least, from our perspective, is it's hard to find a definition of what a likely voter is. At least in the documents, I poured through it this morning to see if I could find it. And if it's obvious somewhere, please, feel free to send an email. Let me know. Yeah. We'll put it in the podcast, in the blog post, what it says.
Sure.
But this is one of those things where, and I think people who listen to this a lot, we're going to be having this conversation more and more, but you do have to ask yourself, what is a likely voter in, April of the election year? And that sort of is a little bit, it makes wanting to see a definition so important. In some ways.
When I look at how similar this is to what we've seen in most of the RV samples that have been released so far, my suspicion is, not suspicion, but, my impression is that the likely voter screen, as they're defined, is probably pretty permissive, given how similar these results look to a lot of what we're seeing. Bit closer race, I think, among Cruz and Allred than we've been seeing, but some other polls have had that race closer. So, and then again, underlines the point about when you move to a likely voter screen. At this point, I think the attention to the Cruz Allred race is still pretty minimal among most voters.
I think that's right. And I think you can even see that in the poll when you look at attitudes towards Allred, which are still largely underdeveloped at this point in the race.
Right. And to also, pay some attention to what their kind of, the mission of of this group is. They did that Hispanic oversample, as you saw, and found more evidence for the fact that there seems to be a closer divide, at least at this point, or a closer split between Trump and Biden among Hispanic voters. And I would point people to that, to the report, which you can find just by Googling their title, and we'll also attach it to this blog post. I'll attach a link to it. But, also sort of melds with what we've been seeing in terms of a little more churn among Hispanics.
Well, and it's tricky because, here's the thing, right? I think on the one hand, this points out something that's important here, right? So when they look at their Hispanic sample, they find Trump actually leading Biden by 4 points, which might lead some people to sort of question the veracity maybe. At the same time, the margin of error among that Hispanic sample is 4.88 points, which basically means they're about even. When we look, we're working on something right now as something of a table setter for 2024, which kind of shows where we are a little bit further, a little bit more in the setup phase. And we look at favorability numbers among Hispanics for Biden and Trump. They don't look terribly different. Now, it doesn't mean that it's the same Hispanics hold positive views towards each. There's obviously all that kind of stuff. But the idea of a close race here among Hispanics at this point is not surprising. But this is where the whole likely voter thing comes back in, which is to say, who is going to show up? What is the turnout rate going to be among Hispanics? What are the demographics within the Hispanic group going to look like? And that's just something that honestly at this point we just can't know. Ultimately the role that immigration is going to play during the presidential race, and this idea of, what happens if we're talking about a mass deportation, scheme on the one hand. On the other hand, we talk a lot about, very serious and real efforts by Republicans in South Texas to mobilize more Hispanic voters. What is the impact? And all this is just to say, just for my money, it's a little bit early.
Yeah.
It's a little bit early to be making.
I guess what I would say is, without, I guess the way that I sort of am taking this in at this point is, I'm less focused on the specific numbers in some ways because of that ambiguity.
Yeah, right.
But, when they find Trump running stronger among male Hispanics without a college degree, that all seems to be relatively consistent with what we've been seeing.
Right.
Worth flagging.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
As I said, and we've taken those numbers and we've plugged them into our newly relaunched poll trackers on our website. So we have a Texas presidential race poll tracker and a U.S. Senate race Texas poll tracker. You'll find those in the same section where you can find this, the blog section at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So, as we move on then, last week while we were on a little hiatus, a small group of current and a larger group of prospective Republican legislators released a document that they are calling a contract with Texas, channeling presumably the Newt Gingrich created Contract with America that was promulgated 30 years ago in 1994 and presaged the kind of Republican taking of the House in the election that year, the rise of, to channel our friend, or to paraphrase our friend Sean Theriault, the Gingrich Republicans,
right?
Who were then the inspiration for Sean's book about the Gingrich senators. But I think the similarities on this really, kind of stop at the title for the most part. I mean, not entirely. I mean, it was an interesting exercise. I went back and kind of looked at the Contract with America again, which I was, I was around for.
Good for you.
Yeah, and there were procedural reforms. Okay. There were a handful of procedural reforms, called for in that document, which, like the ones in this document, were meant to appeal internally, right, to members of the U.S. House at the time. But it also had that document also more famously had something that this document has none of, and that is a list of public policy priorities and somewhere, at the intersection of public policy and ideology. But they were policy, they were pointed in a policy direction. And those were, at the time kind of famously poll tested for both their content and their language. Right. I would say that the contract with Texas looks a lot different and frankly shows a little less work on the back end. in the assembly of these, if you compare the two. So the contract with Texas is made up mostly of proposals for internal changes in the House, rather than a mixture of policy and procedural change that was the case with the original contract. Now, who are we talking about here? And I think that's pretty important, really, because this is a pretty limited universe.
Right.
The announcement was signed initially by 5 Republican incumbents: State Reps Harrison, Lozano, Schatzline, Tinderholt, and Toth.
Right.
For those that listen to this podcast, these, 4 of the 5 of these are a fairly familiar bunch, shall we say, in terms of, being members of the same clique in the House.
I was curious to see how you describe the group.
Yeah, they are, we talk a lot about ins and outs in this podcast, or occasionally they're outs.
Yeah.
In that they are Republicans, they are in the majority. But of the 4, if we'll set aside, we're going to set aside J.M. Lozano for a minute, come back to him. These members are people that are not part of the Speaker's leadership team. Have not been part of the leadership team of, any of the speakers that any of them have served under. Lozano is something of an odd man out here in some ways. He's currently a committee chair, named by definition by the current speaker. And does, if you kind of look, by various indications, I think it's fair to say he has a somewhat more mainline conservative voting record than the others. I'm not saying he's got a liberal voting record, but
I'll also point out he gave one of the nominating speeches for Phelan when Phelan
that's a good point. I'd actually not remembered
speaker.
that. So, and then initially there are other signatory, when this letter was first released, there were also 12 more GOP non-incumbent candidates that were signed on to this, that were candidates in runoffs.
Right.
So, this is all sort of a mixture, the core of this is a kind of, dissident members of the Republican, the governing coalition among the members, and then people that are, angling. And so this is why I shouldn't just leave that angling dangling.
Yeah.
These are people that are involved in runoff races in which, your Republican bona fides, and in particular your demonstration of your conservative dedication, is a big factor. Right. So as we look at the number of items in here, and there's 12?
I think 12, I believe.
Yeah, there are 12 agenda items, and some of these overlap, but I think you can break them into a few little groups. So that give you a sense of what the themes of the document are. So, let's start with, one major theme is to, end practices that are associated with bipartisan cooperation between the majority and Democrats.
Right. Yeah. It's a fair characterization.
I pulled, again, some of these could double count or could be put different ways, but about five items here that are not the first 5. So.
Yeah, and these are things we've heard about before, when they're just being put in one place in some ways, right? So only solicit support for the speakership from Republican members, so don't make it basically a vote of the entire House, or at least have them selected before a vote before the whole House. Ending the practice of awarding committee chairmanship to Democrats. We'll come back to this, I think, but ensuring that all GOP quote-unquote legislative priorities receive a floor vote before any Democratic bills, and then assuring that there are no longer any Democratic majority committees, which I'm not sure. Again, we sort of talked, we have to go back and look. I'm not sure if there were any Democratic majority committees, but we'd have to go check. And then basically select a Republican as Speaker pro tempore. Recently, this has been, usually Moody was until he was part of the quorum break, I think.
Right, and then in the last session, he was replaced, in fact, by a Republican, Charlie Guerin.
Right.
So what do we make of all these? I mean, when you look, there's a certain amount of, and I kind of alluded to this, there's a certain amount of half-baked nature to some of these. I'm just going to put it that way.
Yep.
And in the sense of how much did you really think about implementation? Was thinking about implementation really, it then provokes the question, was thinking about implementation really,
That's
go into this, right? Because, right from the beginning, you could only solicit support for the speakership from Republican members. So are we going to write that into the rules? How, is that going to be enforced in some way? Is that,
like after the
in some basic sense, how that seems to have some rhetorical value.
Right.
Implementation seems a little bit shaky to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you went there because, I mean, because there's two ways you can look at this. And one, you can look at like, again, the implementation piece of it, and the other side is sort of the implications piece of this, which is like, how does this like play out over time, over the course, and all that. But yeah, I mean, you're right. There is sort of this does sound a little bit more like the campaign rhetoric that we've been hearing than it does sound like a set of like, I don't say clearly defined rules for how this would operate, right? And that comes up a little bit more as we go along, right?
Right. And I mean, the other thing that's actually probably the most familiar of all of these in a public sense, and even that, as our polling has shown, not very familiar, is, this notion of ending the practice of making Democrats committee chairs.
Yeah.
That's a practice we've talked about a lot it's been talked about a lot in Republican circles, particularly conservative circles, or the most conservative circles.
Right. In some ways, that's probably going to be the least difficult of a lot of these. I mean,
I mean, I think
of the consequential ones, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, the ending this is already on a downward slope.
Yes.
Right, in which I think the number of feeling Democratic chairs went down from 15 to 8.
I think it was 13 to 8.
Or 13 to 8.
Yeah.
In between the session before last and the current session, we're still technically in.
Right.
I mean, I think you should talk about, you've been pretty bullish on thinking like this thing is over.
Oh, yeah.
It's just a matter of time, right?
Yeah, because look, I think there's two things that are going on right now that both sort of push to the end of Democratic committee chairs. One, I think it's fair to say at the current moment we have a speaker's race, and that we have a current speaker who still holds office and might still hold office, who says he is running again and intends to be the speaker. We have someone else who is announced for speaker, so we can say that we have a speaker's race. And ultimately, the currency of the realm, as far as I can tell, when you're running for speaker, for the most part internally, is like, what are you giving out? Who gets what committee chairs? Who gets what committee assignments? How can you, essentially garner support? And I think, those 8 chairmanships are valuable, right? Especially if we're going to have potentially multiple people angling for the speakership. The idea that you would leave that on the table at this point when you need to garner support, especially within the Republican caucus, seems to me, just from a basic sort of transactional standpoint, to be a non-starter. At the same time, whether or not Democratic committee chairs fundamentally alters the output of the House writ large in a legislative session, I think is something that's pretty debatable given, the output of the House over the last few sessions. But I think, the messiness and the messiness, both the messiness and the success of challengers in this last election cycle means that I think it's very hard to imagine someone becoming speaker at this point and then pointing Democratic committee chairs, knowing that they're creating space for someone to say, see, it's another closet Democrat, even if it's not feeling someone else. And so I just think there's not a lot of benefit at this point.
Well, I mean, I guess it's going to depend on what the dynamics of that speaker race look like. I mean, as I was saying before, I mean, I think the overall thing, you can parse this beyond it there being much value. I mean, I think that if you've moved from 13 to 9, and it's really going to depend on what the contours of the when the actual lobbying and rallying goes on after we know what the electorate is going to look like in the House after the election. Could you get away with some members, saying, yeah, over time we will be phasing this out. I will commit, I'll appoint fewer chairs than I did last time. Or if it's somebody else, I'll appoint fewer chairs than Phelan did last time. I mean, I think there's some negotiating room in there. If in fact a candidate does seem to feel like they need some Democratic votes.
Well, and that's the thing, right? So there's
just no way to know.
So there's two things. There's one is sort of the edge case. I say the Whitmire case, right? You've got some Democrat whose knowledge within a particular area is so valuable that it seems worthwhile keeping 1 or 2 Democratic committee chairs. That's easy enough to say, hey, we're on the way to phasing this out, just as the lieutenant governor did.
Yeah.
Right. And it seems that, the speaker could do the same thing and be, again, point to the lieutenant governor as the North Star on that. At the same time, if the speaker candidate ultimately does need Democratic support in order to, get the speakership, and if that becomes essential, we're talking about a completely different situation than what we're expecting right now.
Right.
I think. And then that's fine. I'm willing to say, hey, the situation changed. This is different. But I'd also say at that point, my prediction shifts and say, okay, before I said there aren't going to be any more Democratic committee chairs, if there are Democratic committee chairs, my guess is that speaker, assuming it's a Republican, which I would, is going to face a significant primary challenge in 2026, like just
Yeah.
right off the bat. And so that's the one thing about it is it's just not an attractive proposition, I think, for any potential future speaker candidates, because all you're doing is sort of inviting the same kind of, for just quick word, crap that, Phelan got over something that every speaker has done before him.
Yeah, I mean, it's just increasing your costs and inconvenience, right?
Well, transaction costs matter, right? It's all,
No,
these guys are aware. So that's why it just seems unlikely.
Yeah. So we'll see. So, there's that cluster of things. We could get too far into the weeds on this, but I want to get to our general sense, because if we don't get to our general sense, then we overinterpret what's here.
Yeah, sure.
We are always cautioning against overinterpretation.
We don't want to overinterpret, yeah.
So I think, the other, kind of group of things are aimed at weakening the office and position of the speaker, and otherwise hamstringing the position of the Speaker of the House, right? So,
right.
They call for limiting the Speaker to 2 terms to reduce their power. And this is their language, to reduce their power over individual members, which I thought was an interesting phrasing, but I get it. And, then this is another interesting one, decentralize power by prohibiting the distribution of political funds from the Speaker.
We'll come back to that one.
We'll come back to the one. I mean, look, we can just flag right now. I mean, there are some interesting legal and even constitutional questions about that.
Right.
So, those are the
also
main,
Also not clear to me that the term decentralized power really works there. When you think about, again, the implications of what this would do.
Well, I mean, I think, right. I mean, what I would say is that, there's the unconscious bursting out there, and that what these are about is decentralizing power, to some degree. Now,
for some people.
Could any, a speaker going in and promising to serve only 2 terms, like a lot of people, will not remember this, but this has been a tactic. People have promised in the past to only serve 1 term or to not run for reelection. Example that comes to mind for me, the most prominent recent one, is Price Daniel Jr. In the early 70s, who promised he would not run for reelection, and by all contemporary accounts was immediately rendered much less powerful in the position of Speaker than he otherwise would have been. It's the usual kind of issue with
lame duck.
Talking about term limits and lame ducks. So
I also think it's important to bring up a point here about the difference between rules versus sort of constitutional limitations, right? And I mean, I think people talk about like, let's make the tax cuts permanent. There's no such thing, right? I mean, there are no such things permanent.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you can say that this is what's going to happen, and if this is a rules-based, or let alone not even a promise, but it becomes something in the rules, well, the rules can change at the beginning of a session.
Yeah, and so and that's where a lot of this will, to get to where we're going, but that's where a lot of this will wind up, right? Is a fight over the rules,
right?
That'll be intertwined in all likelihood with the fight over the speakership.
Yeah,
right. So. And then there's another kind of set of proposals that speak to, to some degree, speak to the recent grievances or carping, ranging from carping to grievances expressed by some House members, mostly in, the general sort of ideological neighborhood of the people of the 5 members that were the spark plug for this. Mm-hmm. And 1 or 2 of these, though, and some of these things, I mean, this is the interesting bunch for me to some degree, because I think some of this might have a little bit of resonance beyond, the people that are driving this. So, there's a claim, and this is a direct quote from the document. There's a call to replace the current liberal parliamentarians with staff committed to only offering advice on adherence to House rules, not to advancing their personal ideology. Now,
ouch.
That's basically, an accusation about the current parliamentarians in the House, both their own personal, political history,
right.
And it's no secret. One of them in particular has worked for Democrats for Hugh Brady, but also, this it really does overlap with the, underlying, kind of burr under the saddle here that the speaker's office has been too powerful. And, look, this is powerful and to some degree capricious and driven by personal agenda rather than what the caucus wants or what's good for Texas or whatever the rhetoric around that is going to be. And And then, related to that, the next thing is, stop parliamentary abuse, again, verbatim, by requiring only substantial adherence to House rules to keep hyper-technical points of order from killing good legislation. So
I love that phrase.
I know,
it's so amazing.
How you write in what is a hyper-technical point of order, how you write into the rules what is good legislation.
Substantial adherence, hyper-technical points of order, good legislation. Okay.
So in terms of art,
which is fine. This is this is as much a campaign document as
well. It's a rich text in that way. Is how I as I said, it kind of gives you some things to really look at and gives you some insight into what people are saying and thinking in this.
I really appreciate that description.
Good. And then, the other two things I would put in this bucket: allow audio video recording of all House proceedings, including point of order debates. Now, what they mean by
what
that,
what do you think they mean by that?
I believe, is not the exchanges between the front and the back mic, which are part of the record, but what we see when everybody goes to the front of the dais and discusses points of order with the parliamentarians and whoever's at the dais. Now, point of order debates is probably, again, a terminological mistake.
Yeah.
Because one would come back and say those debates are part of the record. I mean,
you
want to go look at it. So they, now that's just, they didn't really say what they meant here.
Yeah.
I think. But it's also, again, practically, wanting to have a mic at the front desk for all those discussions and a recording of all that, I think is not likely to be an entirely popular position. But they're making the point, the point they're making is this really is part of this whole pushback, in my mind, against the idea that the parliamentarians are making decisions on points of order and procedure that put more priority, they give too much priority to the goals of the leadership.
Yeah, and I think the idea
with a side shot of, and they're willing to do this because they're closet or barely closeted liberals or something like that.
And I think the idea is that, I think the parliamentarians, I'm not these parliamentarians, but parliamentarians in general, I don't want to speak for anybody specifically, I think would generally say, look, we're not there to enforce any kind of outcome. We're there to enforce the rules.
Right.
And in that sense, we're neutral arbiters. And what this document is clearly saying is, no, you're not.
You're not.
You're not. And given that you're not only, do we want to, sort of change the way that, you're appointed and what your goal is, but we also want to make you objects of observation in the process.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, this is a way of calling attention to the role of the parliamentarians and these particular parliamentarians.
I'll tell you, nothing gets voters ginned up.
Like talk of the parliamentarians and procedure.
First they say, they look at that word if you're doing an online poll and they think, what is that?
Yeah, exactly.
How do I say it?
And then the other thing that, we put in this bucket is, and again, verbatim, start substantive work as soon as session begins to end delays that kill priority legislation. Now, whose priorities?
Yeah.
In fact, depending on, one answer to whose priorities, who sets the priorities, the governor's office would likely say, well, when we have priorities, we declare them emergency items. So
get going. Yeah.
Otherwise, this runs into the Texas Constitution.
Right.
Which creates, the broad deadlines for what can be considered when. Now, the rules do create, the Constitution and the rules create the conditions where you can bypass, you can suspend constitutional rules. It takes a 2/3 vote, as I recall.
Wow.
So there is a procedure for this to happen.
Mm-hmm. Now, is the 2/3, is that 2/3 provision in the Constitution or the rules?
I believe it's in the Constitution.
Okay.
I could be wrong about that. I should look that up.
I'm just thinking about whether there's another way to, skin the cat, as they say.
But I believe that the 2/3 rule is in the Constitution, and we'll check that. So what do we, a lot of our stray thoughts have already kind of leaked out into this because we just can't help ourselves. But, what to make of this? I mean, look, initially the other signatories were candidates who'd already secured the nominations for their seats.
Right.
In addition to the 5 sitting members. And then after the initial rollout, 12 more Republican non-incumbent candidates in runoffs also signed on.
Right.
So, when we started, I said, this is at the intersection really of a looming process about a looming and continuing fight over how the House runs and how the House operates. most notably the power of the speaker.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, in the moment, a campaign document, as you
Absolutely.
said. And, I think you have to consider it first and foremost that in this context, and that it's, its position in the jockeying for the speakership and the writing of the rules, how that unfolds, as we were talking about earlier, is yet to be seen.
Well, it's important to note, I think, as you have, that the majority of the signatories on this do not hold office, have not operated in the House yet, and yet are making these sort of pretty committed, broad statements about how the House should be operated when they get there.
Right.
And so, and I'm not saying that with disdain or anything else, but I'm saying, when you're saying, like, is this like how much of this is a campaign document and how much of it is this other thing? It can be both, but at the current moment, it's very much part of the campaign piece.
Yeah, and look, if somebody listening might be right to sense attention. Well, you're saying the public doesn't pay attention to this. Well, why would this be a campaign document? But, the audience for the primary runoff in a Republican district is a much narrower audience.
Right.
And there is another audience related to that at this juncture, and that is the donor community that is funding a lot of these challenges. It is playing a major role in funding a lot of these challenges.
Right. So
incumbents.
So really, I mean, what this is in a lot of ways is I think, to a lesser extent, though still to an extent, it's a signal to those voters. Again, there's very committed small groups of voters who are eligible to vote in these runoffs in most cases. And to a larger extent, it's a signal to, the donor class that we've talked about a lot in here, and in a particular, sort of the West Texas oil, donor class, about where your commitments lie when the next, speaker's election comes up, how you want the House to be operating. You're making a commitment to sort of that vision of Texas government.
Yeah, and that, and that vision, it emerges pretty clearly, from, the list of demands, as I think was coming up as we were talking about them, that we can put it all in one place. They all express a kind of narrative about what's been going on in the House that's been painted, fairly consistently for the last few years, really going back to the Joe Strauss period.
Yeah. Yeah, it formalizes these criticisms, right?
Yeah.
And it formalizes the criticisms that were being made by dissident Republicans during Joe Strauss up until today. And these criticisms are mostly, again, like, these are not general election issues. This is really, something for GOP primary audience. But the criticisms are, the House is run by Democrats, whether that be, in the formation of committees or, the parliamentarians, putting their fingers on the scale. That the House bottles up GOP priorities, either by leadership directly or through the misapplication or hyper-application of rules.
Or the use of Democratic surrogates as committee chairs.
Right. And this idea that, the House is controlled by the Speaker with, unlimited power, who needs to be restrained or forced to comply, depending on how you look at it, right?
Right. A Speaker who's, owes his speakership to the Democrats, et cetera, is the narrative.
And so when I look at it that way, that's sort of the, this is the sort of the motivation in a lot of ways for a lot of these changes, if I sort of look at this over sort of a longer arc.
No, I think that's pretty clearly what's going on in terms of, how how you assemble a portrait of the House based on the changes that people are allegedly calling for. So,
yeah,
and it reflects, as ever, the ongoing, to some extent, the kind of ongoing agenda struggle within the party, and the way that agenda kind of overlaps all of these conflicts we've been talking about that came to a head in the last session and in this primary. That is, who's gonna define what Republican priorities are, and it's some more abstract, but I also think meaningful level. What is it to be a conservative right now, and what is it to be a Republican? Who are we listening? Where do we look for this? Is it the party platform? Is it the Senate, de facto meaning the lieutenant governor? How much say does the House have in that, and who is going to define who enters into that? Is it going to be the Speaker? Is it going to be the caucus? Is it going to be, a more broad-based sort of will of the House, or is the will of the House going to be pretty tightly adjudicated by the Speaker? And look, speakers and lieutenant governors are always managing that question, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think
Is it the governor? Is it Donald Trump? I mean, there's a lot of different candidates here.
Well, and I think that's ultimately the point, right? I mean, what's interesting about this, in some ways, is that it sort of glosses over one of the biggest sort of axes of conflict that we've been witnessing in the GOP, which is disagreement amongst themselves about either A, what the priorities are, or what the legislative vehicles are going to look like that are going to accomplish those priorities. But the document itself basically, talks about priority GOP, the legislative priorities to ensure all GOP legislative priorities receive a floor vote. And we say, whose priorities, right? Making sure that all GOP priorities receive a vote before any Democratic bills,
right.
I mean, all these things, it's like, well, okay, but if that's there's a lot of sort of, practical implication to this. What if there's a disagreement between the House and the Senate over, what the priority legislation should look like? Not to say that that's a hard example to envision right at this point. But that's, this sort of papers over, I think, kind of some of the basic, I'm going to say papers over, but it's interesting to me that it's sort of saying, look over here, because in some ways, it's sort of like most of the dysfunction that Republicans have experienced in the last year of legislating was not because of Democrats. It was not because of floor procedures or chubbing or the calendar. It was because of conflicts between themselves, between the legislative leaders, between the lieutenant governor.
Right.
And I mean, the other thing is, like, I think, I'm going to go back to this. I'm just going to throw this out there. I'm sorry.
I mean, we'll give the Democrats some credit. I mean, there were Democrats that were good at making mischief within this situation, which is what you're supposed to do if you're a minority party, or at least one of the things you're supposed to do.
Right. I think that's right. I'd also say, if the speaker really did have all the power that he's sort of envisioned as having according to this document, you think he would have just forced everyone to vote through a voucher bill and be done with it. I mean,
I mean, that's,
just to kind of,
that, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, in the sense that I don't think that he was necessarily opposed to vouchers. It was just that he didn't have the votes on the floor. Now, if he really did have all this power and the governor was saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go after your members, I'm going to go after you, et cetera, seems like that would have been pretty easy to solve with a speaker as powerful as this document envisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the problem here is that the speaker, look, at the end of the day, the speaker is not on the same page as they are completely.
Right.
But, the other thing, like sort of stepping back from this is, it's one of two things, I think. It's either, underestimates or, doesn't acknowledge the reason you have presiding officers in a legislative body. And I'm not a legislative theorist or philosopher. But
you can pretend. I think you're pretty close.
But, well, I mean, I think it's clear enough. You have to, you have a speaker, you have a presiding officer, because the presiding officer is required to maintain process.
Yeah.
And, to the extent that, they are representative of the majority, to manage both the politics of the majority and the politics of the body as a whole. Mm-hmm. And we hear that, all the time in different areas. And this just seems, to be saying, what we need? We need the Speaker of the House to be like a weak prime minister.
It's funny you say that.
And I don't know why any, I think and look, this does then get you back to what some of the complaints about this speaker and the last speaker and, and the stakes of a speakership always are, which is, to do the preponderance of members, particularly of the majority party.
Yeah.
But also, and I think this is obviously undersold here, the minority party, do they feel like the speaker is to what extent is the speaker protecting their interests? Mm-hmm. And that's such a cliche, and we hear it all the time.
Right.
How much is the speaker protecting the members? And so you can look at this and say the underlying narrative in this and the spirit of the proposals on a win and say, yes, there is a tyrannical speaker, and we want to, change the institutional practice and reduce the power of the speaker. But, I think seasoned members are going to say, so I want a speaker that's not going to be able to protect me and look out for my interests, and I'm going to be more on my own. That might appeal to some people, but it might not to others.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point in a prior podcast a ways back, I said something to the effect of, I'm pretty sure that most Republican members are happy for Dade Phelan to be their shield right now.
Yeah.
And I think they're still happy that Dade Phelan was their shield through a lot of this, because it's a lot easier to say, yeah, I guess this is, or not even to say nothing and let other people blame the speaker while, you're not forced to take a vote that you don't really want to take. You know, I mean, that's ultimately, kind of what, in a basic sense, what this has been about. I mean, I think back over the last, 5 sessions and sort of, you go back about 10 years and you have some Republicans who wanted to push for, total abortion bans. And the idea was, well, I don't know if we really want to take a vote on a total abortion ban in the state, or we want to do constitutional carry. I said, well, I don't know if that's really where we're at right now. Now, look, ultimately, and this is sort of what I think the criticisms of Phelan's leadership, et cetera, are sort of interesting from conservatives. All that stuff is passed.
Right.
It's all happened. But I think this dynamic is one of those things that's sort of coming up again, where I think the most dissident members and sort of the most extreme members of the party, and here I'm talking even into the donor class, et cetera, essentially, I think what they want is they want every one of these pieces of legislation to come up for an up or down vote on the House floor in a timely manner and force these members to take these votes. Now, it's easy for Democrats because they'll just vote against it. For a lot of Republicans in these sort of suburban districts and sort of, slightly more competitive districts, slightly less ideologically homogenous and extremely conservative districts, those are tough votes.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the speaker protects them from, but that's also what I think the dissidents are criticizing here.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. And that's what I was getting at, right? Which is that if I think this reflects, the narrow, interests of members in certain kinds of districts and really discounts, what a speaker, can really do for you as a member. And, they want to reduce that because I think they've not, they've again, in this sense, it's a broad-based, it's a broadside against the way things are run now. Yeah. But from a relatively narrow perspective.
Well, it's a broadside against the way things are run now from the same people who always criticize the way things are run. And so ultimately, this isn't really a contract with Texas because, as we know, voters don't pay attention to the inner operations of the House. There's multiple data points we could point to that speak to that. But it's essentially a proposal to change the operation of a House in a way that would allow for more extreme legislation to make its way through the process by changing the power dynamics here. Right.
So, in the end, I mean, this looks both to the end game of the primary runoffs. I mean, it is a document in some ways of the moment in that sense, given its narrow, the narrow audience for it. Right. So, it becomes another exercise in signaling the ideological commitment of these members and the lack of will to compromise. Right. That's, and again, that's a very
dirty word.
Different, it's a different, it's envisioning a different kind of body to my mind. And again, this has a very narrow public audience, and internally, this will give, we were talking about this before we came on, this list of a dozen things does provide something of an agenda and almost a kind of menu if we see a speaker's race in which there are enough votes in this faction of the House that can hang together and affect the outcome.
Yeah, I think that's right.
In a very kind of, in addition, your point earlier, members, and we know this from history, from social, members are first and foremost self-interested, and they're looking about what is going to help them in all this. Yeah. But when it comes down to bargaining, this will be a list of things that a speaker candidate may be able to sit down with some people and say, look, and then what these conversations are going to look like, I would not, try to get too close to reproducing. But in general terms, look, there are some things we can give you and some things we can't. Yeah. Or we're willing to give you, some things we're not willing to give you, like the unconstitutional things we'll probably pass on. Right. But, a few of these things are pretty easy. And in some ways, as you kind of pointed out about the Democratic majorities and committees, or even the Democratic committee chairs, are already on their way to being delivered or already a thing. Sure, we could, from now on, the pro temp appointment, the pro tempore appointment will be a Republican. Right. Fine. Right. But I'm also just really struck by, the timing of this is interesting. As much as we talk about the nationalization of politics, a play not dissimilar to this was made by ideologically similar faction in the U.S. House of Representatives, first in electing, as the price of Kevin McCarthy's election. Right. which was aimed at distributing power a little more broadly, making sure that some of that distribution of power benefited, quote unquote, movement or dissident conservatives in terms of, membership on the, who got appointed to the Rules Committee. And, what did that get McCarthy? It got him deposed.
Well, and ultimately they gave him too much, right?
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's what all of the, and the kinds of things they gave them are the kinds of things that you're seeing these House members in the Texas House call for.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, hearing you talk about, what I think about, to this idea of self-interest. When we say self-interest, just to be clear here, when we say that members are self-interested, we mean we're self-interested in whatever is going to keep them in office. We don't mean like they're trying to line their pockets or whatever. We're just saying they're single-minded seekers of re-election is the term of art in political science. But it is interesting. It does sort of what I'm thinking about here now is how, you can be in a situation where individually some of these changes could be seen as good for you as a member, but collectively as a body might lead to some pretty perverse circumstances. I mean, for example, if the concern here is that, Democrats have too much power through these sort of ways that I think are totally fanciful, just to say it out loud, this sort of fantasy of this Democratic power. It's like, no, I mean, they're not powerful in the way they say. To the extent that Democrats have some power, they have the power usually to try to delay, to obstruct, to slow down. Now, if you basically say to Democrat, but we often talk about shoving and things like that. And if you think about a Democratic member with a good bill who wants to move it forward, and you're just kind of waiting for your turn in line, well, your turn in line just went way, way, way to the end. Yeah. And so one of the things that I think it brings up is it does really creates the incentive for Democrats to be, as obstructionist as they can possibly be and kind of work the clock from the beginning. I mean, there's no reason to sort of sit around and say, hey, we've all got bills to pass. Let's make sure we represent each other. It's like, no, because we're only dealing with your priority legislation for however long. We may never even get to this bill on, nurse regulations or whatever, all the sort of regular stuff the legislature does. I also think this idea of decentralizing power is really interesting because, and I'm just going to point this out, you've got a governor who just spent over $6 million of out-of-state money against Republican incumbents, but the proposal is actually to prohibit the speaker from distributing funds to Republican incumbents. So it does. So when we say, this idea of, decentralizing power, we're not decentralizing power. Actually, we are centralizing power, or at least I'll say this. We're taking away one of the counterweights.
Well, certainly that aspect of it
is sort of,
that seems self-defeating to the chamber overall. I mean, I think, the decentralizing impulse that's present here is, is in other things.
Yes.
Right. I mean, it's in, limiting the speakers, the number of terms that somebody can serve as speaker.
Right.
Diddling with committee assignments and, this idea of who gets to, how fast you're going to deal with legislation. And I think, again, what is your theory of how the House should operate and what the House should do? Mm-hmm. And I think, the underlying, to the extent that there is an underlying theory here, it's kind of what I would say historically and institutionally naive one.
Yeah. No.
Unless, if you take it in its own terms, and that just points you to something I think is kind of implied in the points you're making, which is that, well, this is less about the House and more about the broader ideological definition of the party.
Yeah.
And who is driving that agenda. And at this point, a group of members who are by and large more aligned with, the wing of the party that is represented most directly by the lieutenant governor. Mm-hmm. And, and winds up playing into the hands ultimately of a thing we've talked about a lot in here. Were you to see this implementation, I think you're right. It would strengthen the Senate vis-a-vis the House.
Yep.
But it would strengthen the governor probably vis-a-vis both.
Yeah, I think that's right.
On the continuing trajectory that we've already been on. So, I think to close out, I think we'll see this, on one hand, I was reluctant to want to talk about it because it is such a niche move and it's the promulgation of it was designed to get some press, I think, and to help, these candidates that are in these runoff races right now while setting the stage for what's going to happen.
Laying some markers in the sand.
Laying some markers and like I keep saying, putting a establishing a bargaining menu, when we get to whatever is going to happen with the speaker's race. But I mean, I think where we've wound up is what's interesting about this and that it does provide us a little more indication. I like it. It crystallizes by crystallizing these complaints in the way that we were talking about and helping us kind of go, oh, here's this fixed thing. Mm-hmm. We can see what the underlying narrative and understanding of what's going on is here and how, this faction kind of sees what's going on. It's an interesting historical document. And I will be interested to see what kind of longevity it has.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting escalation in their tactics, right?
Yeah,
this is not new in some ways, but this is a much more defined version. And to your point, this is going to have some sort of short-term impact, on the primaries, maybe indirectly, maybe directly. Yeah. We'll see. What I'm thinking about, with this is I'm curious about this document's longevity, right? Both past the primaries and then for me, I think this is obviously it could play, as you've already said, into the speaker's race. But then the other piece also to me is, depending on how this all shakes out, does this become, yet again a new axis of conflict for the next round of Republican primaries?
Right. And is there anybody in this? So I think after the runoffs and then the general election is over, how we were talking about this before too. How big will the quote unquote contract with Texas faction be?
Right.
In the legislature that is seated in January. Right. And, then attendant to that, how much solidarity is there? Who will emerge as the leader and how competent will that leader be as a broker for this, at this point what we have to call kind of a proto-faction?
Yeah.
Because as, we were saying before, I mean, look, it's one thing to sign on to this contract with Texas when you're in the middle of a primary runoff.
Yeah.
It's another once you get on the ground and the bargaining starts.
Right.
To actually stick with that conviction. And again, this is fungible. That's what I mean by the menu. It's a fungible list. So we'll see, what has legs and what doesn't when what doesn't when the race really comes on.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing about this. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying, and I think what's interesting is that, if this were 5 or 6 years ago, I mean, if you look at the size right now of the group as it seems to be constructed before anyone else has jumped on bandwagon, it seems to be about the same size as the dissident wing usually is, give or take, maybe 5 members or so, depending on which era you look at. Historically, it's been pretty common for kind of the majority of the Republican caucus to just sort of swat this aside. I do think that the emergence of Oliverson challenging Phelan while he's still in office, the emergence of this document shows a certain amount of muscularity in the dissident side of the party that feels like they're in a position right now to really try to, I think, leverage what they've done already in terms of going after incumbents and sort of in their sort of temporary alignment with some of the other statewide leaders on this, and to try to get sort of the biggest gains they can. Now, does it just get swatted away? Do we just see, most of the Republican legislators and all the Democrats elect a speaker and these 20 guys, kind of voting for somebody else? Or does it start to bleed and spill over because some of these members are looking at sort of what happened in this last primary cycle and say, I don't need that kind of trouble.
Right. Well, I think that in terms of that, I mean, it's a good moment for them to release it.
Yeah.
And to try to get people to sign on the dotted line,
because
then they can go back and try to hold people to account at the time that this may or may not be relevant in a speaker's race.
Right.
But they will try to make it relevant.
For sure.
I mean, there's no two ways that's not about the fact that that's partially what this is about, particularly for the members that are already incumbents or that are expecting, to have a, resistance-free election. And there's not a decent faction. And in that sense, if you count absolutely everybody, it probably is a little bigger than the dissident faction in the West.
Yeah, probably. It'd have to be.
A little more numerous.
Yeah.
But that's why I think the question of, what you signed on to in a Republican primary runoff and what you're sort of committing to once you're seated, historically, there can be some daylight between those two things. So with that, we'll keep an eye on this. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Some of the polling results we've talked about, some of the links we've mentioned, you'll find in a post accompanying this podcast at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. You'll also find those poll trackers I mentioned earlier. So thanks again to those of you who are listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.